Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. This time I'll be painting one of the new Cadian shock troopers from the Cadia Stands box set. With this being a popular new release, there's a few guides already out there attempting to replicate the studio scheme. However, as a former box art painter, I thought I could shed some light on the process and show exactly how Eavy Metal would approach them. These are the paints I'll be using during this video. First of all, I've gone ahead and base coated the whole model using a 50-50 mix of Karak Stone and Baneblade Brown. To save myself a bit of time here, I ended up using an airbrush just to quickly get this layer down. If you don't have access to an airbrush, then I recommend using a light primer to save yourself the headache of base coating by brush over black. If you're opting to use a spray can primer, then I thoroughly recommend Tamiya light grey or white for this. For the initial soft shade here, I'm going to be using Baneblade Brown, and this is applied at a glaze consistency around all of the recesses of the fatigues. You can also glaze this towards the lower parts of the cloth to add some volume into the shapes. For these initial stages, so base coating, layering and applying the soft shade, I really recommend using a larger brush. This is a Rosemary & Co. Series 33 size 0, and it's still perhaps a little on the small side for this. I would usually opt for a size 1 to 2, just because it holds a lot more paint and you don't have to keep refilling it. And it also feels like you get a smoother result on a larger area like this. So I keep just working around the fatigues here, building up the shading and coming back to some areas once they're dry. This soft shade stage is really quite hard to see at first, although it's a little easier to see in person. And it is quite important if we're looking to build a smooth transition in the shading of the cloth. Now I just wanted to mention that this video, along with all of my videos, is really trying to demonstrate how to paint the box art as closely as possible, and this means following the studio recipe and stages, and that can take a lot of time. And I think in the studio one of these would be around about 2 days. Now I realise that's a lot of time, and for a lot of you might be picking up the Cadians with the goal of doing them as an army, and I think this is doable to a good standard. However, I would possibly drop some of these stages, and this might be one of those as it's a bit too subtle. Now at this point I like to quickly go around and black out the surrounding areas of armour and leather. These will be a darker colour later on, and I find this just helps to keep me more focused on the area that I'm working on, and it also provides a good base coat for the darker colours, as well as being able to leave a fine black separating line between the different areas later on. Once that was done, I continued on with the fatigues by adding another soft shade of Steel Legion Drab. This is really nice to glaze with, and you can concentrate this even more towards the recesses of the fatigues. As I mentioned previously, if I was painting lots of these, I would cut the previous stage and probably start here, because thin down it actually glazes really nicely on its own, and you can use this very thin down to add volumes to the cloth. Try not to worry too much if you do go a bit too heavy with this stage, as it's easy to rectify mistakes just by going back and tidying up areas with the base coat. For the final deep shade on the fatigues, I'll be using Rhinox Hide, and I must admit that I did change the recipe very slightly here and added in some Steel Legion Drab. I was a little skeptical of the recipe, which was saying to jump straight to Rhinox Hide, and I think this would actually be fine, but perhaps a little harsher. However, if something doesn't look right to you in a recipe, or if the change in value seems too harsh, don't be afraid to make a mix and soften the transition. I'm keeping this as quite a precise line shade into all of the recesses of the cloth. It's a good idea to switch to a smaller, sharper brush for this, and one that you'd be more comfortable with placing edge highlights. As this is for a deep shade, we're pretty much looking for the precision of a fine edge highlight. I've thinned down this deep shade roughly 50-50 with water, and this will hopefully allow it to flow into the recesses more easily. One thing that I did notice on these Cadians was that the line that follows the trim of the jacket is actually quite soft in some areas. So in order to get a stronger definition in these lines, we effectively need to paint in the deep shade. And then when we come to highlight around this later, it will look like the recess is more strongly defined. Now for the first highlight on the fatigues, I'll be using Karak Stone, and I'm applying this first as an edge highlight, but also glazing this around the uppermost folds and the areas of the cloth that are going to be catching the light. When it comes to cloth in general, it can be a good idea to blend out this first stage to soften out the highlights, as when we're painting cloth, we're not just painting a hard edge like armor a lot of the time. Now it's fine to make some sharper lines where it needs it, like along the edge of the coat here. But overall, if we're going for a higher quality of finish and one that's more sympathetic to the sculpt and the material, blending out the highlights more on cloth is a good idea. Having said that, again, if this is for an army, this is something I would cut back on, as glazing anything is definitely a time sink, and in that case, just a couple of edge highlights will look perfectly fine, and also help to keep a more uniform look to the unit. Now for the next more controlled edge highlight, I'll use a 50-50 mix of Karak Stone and white. Any white will work well, but I'm particularly fond of AK white as it's really smooth and nice to work with. Now you can just concentrate this on the most upwards facing folds, however I also like to use it on the coat edge and the line just to give it a nice clean and defined look. I switched here to a nice sharp brush, and this is my go-to for edge highlights these days. It's a Winsor & Newton Series 7 miniature size 0. Normally I would use the size 1 though. These can be quite costly, and a couple of other brush companies have something similar, like Artis Opus Series M and Rosemary Series 323. Now the fatigues are all finished, it's time to move on to the green armour. For this I used a mix of 3 parts Loren Forest, 2 parts Castellan Green and 1 part Caliban Green. I recommend making a separate pot of this for consistency and avoiding having to mix the exact hue every single time. This is one of those awkward heavy metal mixes that seem quite strange at first, but will hopefully make more sense once we start to highlight the armour up. I often get asked why the colours listed on the boxes don't seem to match the official paint jobs, and I think it's for reasons like this. The paint list at the beginning of this video will also show just how many different colours go into a single box art miniature, and for the vast majority of people just wanting to get an army on the table quickly, the heavy metal recipes and techniques can seem quite excessive and intimidating, so I guess it's necessary for them to be simplified. I think it would also be quite creatively limiting as a painter being forced to follow any particular paint system, and it makes it quite difficult for a team of painters to produce their best work without being able to fine-tune the recipes as they see fit. In fact, nowadays we're spoilt for a choice of paint. Thinking back to the previous paint range around 10 years ago, everything was a mix as there were far less choice of any particular hue. So back to the miniature now, I'm just going to quickly go around and base coat the leather areas here at the same time. It's important when base coating to apply quick thin coats, coming back for another coat only once the first is fully dry. This avoids causing tearing of the semi-dry paint layers, which will result in unwanted texture in the paint. Now it's time to shade the green armour with a 50-50 mix of Caliban Green and Black. Again, I thin this roughly equally with water and carefully line in around all of the panels. Now you could also use this stage to glaze towards the bottom of some of the panels. I didn't do that this time because I'm just trying to replicate the box art as closely as I can. Obviously this would add even more time to the paint job, and I actually think this scheme looks bolder and more consistent throughout an army without overshading the green too much, and for this reason I would just stick to the line shade. Don't forget, if you do mess up here at any point with the shading, it's very easy just to go back in and tidy with the base coat before moving on to the next stage. Now these Cadian miniatures are absolutely fantastic sculpts and everything feels very well engineered and scaled for the world. However, that does also make them quite small detail wise, and it can maybe be a bit more difficult to judge your highlight stages properly and also to keep everything sharp enough. So it's best to make this first chunky highlight stage wide enough so that we can comfortably fit in the next stages. Again, I'm using a fine detail brush for this, a Winsor & Newton Series 7 miniature size 0. For the next sharp edge highlight stage on the armour, I'll use Straken Green, and this is applied around all of the edges of the panels. For finer edge highlights like this, make sure not to overload your brush. Just the tip of the brush should have enough paint on it, and I often use the side of my hand to adjust the amount of paint on the brush. I also tend to thin the paint slightly less for this stage, just adding a slight touch of water to the paint. For the final highlight stage on the armour, I used Nurgling Green. There's not really a right or wrong way to do this, and you can just apply this around the most upwards facing edges, or you can also go for a super sharp look and highlight around almost everything. If you are doing a lot of these, to save some time at least, I would recommend just concentrating it towards the tops of the armour. Finally, I applied some dots of Krieg Khaki on the sharpest corners of the armour. You can also decide whether to keep the armour clean at this point, or like I did, perhaps add some subtle chipping and scratches. I did this by using the same highlight stages I had previously used, and trying to keep the scratches nice and fine so that it feels in scale with the rest of the miniature. Now that the armour was finished, it was time to paint the leather, and as we've already base coated these areas with Rhinox Hide, the next thing to do is to shade them. So for this I made a 50-50 mix of Rhinox Hide and black, and then thinned this a bit with some water. You can then glaze this towards the lower parts of the straps and into the recesses of the leather. Once that was done, I applied a first chunky edge highlight using Doombull Brown around all of the edges of the leather. For the next stage highlight, I used Steel Legion Drab, and again this is applied slightly thinner this time, around all of the edges of the leather. Now for the final highlight stage on the leather, I used Karak Stone. As mentioned with the armour stage, you can concentrate this highlight towards the most prominent edges and corners. Now you don't have to do this, but I did add a few little white dot highlights just by adding some white into the Karak Stone. Now there is actually a second type of leather that is used on the gaiters of the boots of the Cadian, and for this I made a base coat with a 2-to-1 mix of Steel Legion Drab and Rhinox Hide. Once that was dry, I shaded towards the bottom of the panels and recesses using glazes of thinned down Rhinox Hide. If you have any deeper recesses and perhaps around rivets like this, you can add a touch of black into the Rhinox to increase the contrast. Once the shading was done, I did just quickly go back round and tidy using the base mix just to get a nice smooth finish ready for the first highlight stage. For the first stage highlight on the boot gaiters, I used Steel Legion Drab. For the next stage highlight, I used a 50-50 mix of Steel Legion and Karak Stone. For the final highlight, I used Karak Stone towards the most prominent edges. I did go on to add some white into the Karak Stone, just to pick out a few spot highlights. Finally, I picked out the buttons using pure Vallejo Model Air Silver. Now onto the black parts of the boots. I quickly tidied up the base coat with a fresh coat of AK Black, and then I applied a chunky edge highlight of Corvus Black. This is a very subtle first stage highlight, and it's just a standard grey highlighted black on the boots, but I think if I wasn't following the box art recipe so closely, I would probably instead use my normal recipe for a neutral black, which would be something like 50-50 Eshin Grey and Black, followed by a 50-50 Eshin and Dawnstone, and then finally Administratum Grey. The jump here between this Corvus stage and the next highlight, which is Mechanicus Standard Grey, is a bit too much of a jump for me. Speaking of the Mechanicus stage, unfortunately the footage was corrupted for that part, but as you can see here, it was placed as a finer edge highlight around all the edges of the boots, before moving on to this even sharper edge highlight of Administratum Grey. Again, just on the most prominent edges. Black can be quite tricky as we have to keep the highlight stages very fine. However, remember that you can always go back in with the Corvus stage and tidy up any of the sharper stages. Finally, just to finish off the boots, I did place a few dot highlights just by adding some white into the Administratum Grey. Now that's finished, it's time to paint the metal, and I didn't have any recipe listed for the metal elements on the miniature, so I just did a standard gunmetal for this. My go-to paint for this would be Vallejo Dark Aluminium. This is an airbrush paint that comes in a larger pot. It's very thin as it's an airbrush paint, so it's a bit harder to control, but it does give a very nice finish. Or instead of that, sometimes I do like to use a mix of Vallejo Model Air Silver mixed with black until you reach a gunmetal tone. Just any black paint will do for that. Having said that, if all you have is Citadel Lead Belcher, then that will work perfectly fine for small areas like these. Now once this was dry, I used a thinned down black ink, and this was just Liquitex Carbon Black, and I used this to shade into the recesses of the metal. So I have listed Nuln Oil here instead, as to be honest, for small details like this it won't matter too much. There's also loads of other black washes and contrast paints that will work. Even a thinned down Abaddon Black would work well for this purpose. Once that was dry, I went back to our old friend Vallejo Model Air Silver for the sharp edge highlights. Honestly, I love this paint a lot. It's probably the closest paint I have to perfection. It's super smooth, it has a fine flake size, and it flows really well for sharp edge highlights like this. So I really recommend picking some up. However, if you don't have this, you could also use any other bright silver. Now it's time to paint the weapon casing, and for the base coat here I'll be using Nocturne Green. This paint doesn't have the best coverage, so it will take a couple of coats to get an opaque layer. As I'm painting a sergeant this time, he has a chainsword and a bolt pistol, but this is the same recipe that's used on the Cadian las guns and other weapons. I also used a little thinned down black paint to shade the weapon casing, and I glazed this into the recesses and around the panel lines. After this, I applied the first chunky edge highlight of Death Corps Drab. Now, following the recipe, I started to highlight with Nurgling Green. Beware here that the jump in value is quite harsh. I later made a 50-50 mix of Nurgling and Death Corps to help soften the transition, and I would really recommend doing that. Just like I was saying earlier, don't be afraid to add some mixes in between your stages if you feel like it's too harsh of a jump. I also started to add some subtle chipping or scratches to the chainsword, as it just makes sense that this area would receive more damage from just general wear and tear. So these edges on the back of chainswords can be a real nightmare, and I think that everyone struggles a bit with these. For any straight long sections like this, I recommend using the side of the tip of the brush to carefully pick out the edge. Placing highlights like this, if the edge isn't sharp enough, is quite risky and can result in a line that's not very smooth, so I recommend tidying these up afterwards if they need it. Finally, I placed a few dot highlights on the corners of the weapon by adding white into the Nurgling Green. Now I did go on to paint the face using the Caucasian skin recipe. I've used that in a previous video and you can find that here on Patreon, so feel free to check that out. I won't be including that in this tutorial as it's already a huge video, but there's a ton of awesome head sculpts in this kit, and it might be something that I could cover in a future video with lots of different skin tones. The black and the green here was just following the same armor and black boot recipe that I've already covered in this video. And that's it for this video. Thank you to everyone here on Patreon for your continued support. I really do enjoy making fully comprehensive guides like this. However, they do take a lot of time to produce and I really couldn't do it without your support. So thank you for that and I'll catch you in the next video, guys.